Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted to live the life of your dreams, then do we have the God and Love on Route 80 show for you. Today I'll be talking with Dr. Stephen G. Post, the best-selling author of Why Good Things Happen to Good People, the founder of the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love, and a brilliant new book on the meaning of life and the importance of spirituality, God and Love on Route 80. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about living your dream and the hidden mystery of human connectedness. That, plus we'll talk about making lampshades, Mercedes 190s, Harley shovelheads, the power of chanting, your dad rear-ending your mom on the Long Island Expressway, that is, and what in the world downward spiraling vortexes into an immoral universe have to do with anything. So welcome to the show, Stephen. Are you ready to shine?
I am ready to shine and be radiant.
Woohoo! So today we're going to talk first about your story, and then we're going to jump into some how-tos. But before we dive right into things, what was the repeated dream you used to have as a child?
When I was 15, I was up in New Hampshire at a school called St. Paul's. It's really kind of a bit of an expensive orphanage, but it got me off Long Island. And I had a recurring dream for about a year and a half. It recurred a dozen times, maybe 8 or 9 times. And it was really powerful. I would, early in the morning, have this experience. It wasn't quite sleeping. It wasn't quite being awake. But I would see this gray, silvery mist coming toward me. And I was on a road somewhere headed toward the west.
Yeah.
Then I would see a young man with stringy blonde hair on a ledge, leaning over and about to jump. At that point, the silvery mist would evaporate, and the dream filled with blue, and especially with the image of a blue angel that in a feminine voice said to me, "If you save him, you too shall live." And then the angel disappeared.
Wow. And how did it sounds like something you were talking to your teachers about, which you were very brave, I must say. You were talking to the fellow students about. What was going through your mind? Because this, to quote Dr. Eben Alexander, who's had the near-death experiences, this in a sense was more real than real, wasn't it?
It really was more real than real. I had a wonderful sacred studies teacher, an Episcopal priest named Rod Wells. He was a friend of a lot of the great Buddhists of the generation, and he and I talked about this, and I discussed it in class with my fellow students at least a dozen times. And Rod got so excited by this as adolescent spirituality, but something that a lot of people don't take seriously. Don't think that kids can have these meaningful experiences, but they do. So he was a graduate of Yale Divinity School, and one afternoon we drove to Yale. We drove to New Haven from New Hampshire, and I gave a presentation for about 3 hours in a class on spirituality and psychology with this famous Jungian professor named James Dittes. And he asked me all about the dream. And you know, I told him that, look, we all read Emerson's The Oversoul up at St. Paul's. It's kind of required for everybody. And I said, I think I'm the only kid there who actually believes in this idea of a one mind, a universal mind, that mind comes before matter and informs everything and shapes everything, and that we are connected in these incredibly subtle ways. And it was a wonderful conversation that went on for 3 hours, and I just had such a great experience because these were about a dozen Masters of Divinity students. They were really interested in what I had experienced.
What's fascinating to me is, and I just went to this R Day Conscious, American Renewable Energy conference or symposium here outside Aspen, and was guided to just the right people at just the right time, including Dr. Anita Sanchez, who spent a lot of time with the Oshawa, a native tribe down in the Ecuadorian rainforest, by the Brazilian rainforest. And they talk about the dream world being the waking world, or the dream world being the real world. You were talking with somebody who's involved with Jungian psychology, which to me, Jung, whenever I talk with somebody about Jung, I'm talking about the dream world as the real world, or the symbols and signs we see in the real world being the guidance pulling us forward. And that's what you were experiencing, weren't you?
Yeah, very much so. And I loved Jung. I read about synchronicity. Uh, I had a lot of opportunity to think about these things really as a young kid, and I took the dream into my soul. It wasn't the case that I knew where it was leading me. I had no strong sense of its veracity, of its truth value, but my intuition was that this was somehow the universal mind kind of breaking into my very narrow individual consciousness and connecting me with somebody who was very, very far away, but I had no idea where, and certainly it had nothing to do with my personal goals.
I,
So it
I,
was destiny.
I love it. And that's something when I coach people, if it has nothing to do with somebody's personal goals, yet you feel a tug, I think you have to take action on it because it's coming from somewhere greater than, I'll put that in quotes, greater than yourself.
Absolutely. I call it the infinite mind, and it's completely obvious across the universe. It precedes all matter. It is the ground of being, and it also exists within each of us individually as a special point of light, and we can connect with it. And then we are surprised by the ways in which we are, in fact, interconnected in this unity.
So let's go from there. Let's talk about interconnectedness, being pulled, a greater mind, and making lampshades.
Oh yeah. Oh my goodness. So I got into Swarthmore, all right, and that was a good liberal arts college.
Mhm.
Um, it was after I'd graduated from St. Paul's. I was at home on Long Island, and I had a pretty big argument with my mother and father because Rod Wells, my sacred studies teacher, had gotten me a job in the Bronx tutoring kids, and I loved doing that. I actually did it up in New Hampshire
Mhm.
with a lot of the French Canadian families. So this is really what I was called to do at the time. But my mom and dad said that the Bronx was too dangerous. You can't do this, and it got pretty heated. And finally, after the threat of not covering my college, I relented and I said, "Okay, but what will I do instead?" And my dad, who was the president of W&J Sloan's lamp store, it's a department store in New York that doesn't exist anymore, but it was pretty famous at the time. He knew all the factories around greater New York. So he said, "Why don't you work in Bill DeBono's lampshade factory in Patchogue?" And I did. I spent 2 weeks, and I say this respectfully, driving to Patchogue uh, from West Islip in my dad's secondhand gray Mercedes 190 that had seen much better days, that I know he bought just so that he would look good bringing his kid up to St. Paul's. And they had their family car at home. So I would drive this to the factory. And for these 2 weeks, I stood between two very large, very nice Italian women, and I cut cardboard. After a couple of weeks of this on a Friday night, I just realized I couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't my thing. So I drove out in the Mercedes to West Hampton Beach, which is kind of a hangout town for young people. And I had a gal friend there named Lee, and I some friends from St. Paul's lived there in the summers. And about 11 at night, I decided, I don't feel called to go to college. It's just not calling me in my soul. And somehow or another, I want to follow this dream. Of course, it wasn't just the pull of the dream, because it was also the push of this argument I had with my parents. And it was just sort of
Fuel, Stephen. It was
the fuel.
fuel.
Yeah, it was push and pull. So I drove that Mercedes. Um, down the Sunrise Highway on Long Island. I drove through the Midtown Tunnel. I drove up the FDR Drive. I drove over the George Washington Bridge,
Mm.
and I'd never been west of the George Washington Bridge,
Wow.
but I saw a sign and it said Route 80 West. There was another sign that said 95 South, but that wasn't in the West was the dream.
Yeah.
So I drove across Jersey about 5 in the morning. I'm smack dab in the middle of the great long state of Pennsylvania. I'm actually by the Lewisburg exit. Now, cars back in those days, they had generators.
Mhm.
And once the generator broke down, there was no energy at all. There was no light. The engine stopped, and you were lucky if you could pull over. Well, just before this happened with this gray Mercedes 190, I had been second guessing my decision to head west. I'd been thinking, if I just do a U turn over the Midway, I can probably get home and no one will notice the difference and my reputation will be intact. So, but that's not what happened. So I got the car over on the right hand shoulder. There's nothing for miles and miles and miles but cornfields and wheat fields. There's no telephone booths, nothing. So I did the only thing that a kid could do. I took a piece of paper out of the glove compartment and I wrote in pencil to the Pennsylvania State Police, please return this car to Henry A.V. Post, 44 Davison Lane, West Islip, New York, 516-669-5655 from his son, who no longer works in the lampshade factory. This is a confession. I'm just telling you, this is what happened. And so I had a classical guitar. I was pretty good with Villalobos and
Mm.
Granados and Ponce. I had little some books, Siddhartha. I had a few other sort of classic things from that era. And I put my thumb out, and a big white truck came by. It was the first vehicle that passed by, and it stopped. Guy swung the big door open, and his name was Gary, and he said, "Come on in. Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going west." And that was how the journey began.
I love that you had Siddhartha with you among others, because there is a clear parallel here between leaving the lampshade business, so to speak, and leaving it all behind and going out on the road, and him leaving the kingdom that was coming to him behind and going out on the road.
Yeah, very, very, very much so, very much so. And I was also reading Aldous Huxley's work, quite a bit,
Yeah.
especially the perennial philosophy, which is a lot about this idea of one mind and how mind comes before matter. So that was my mindset, and I kind of felt that, well, I'm just gonna. I could have said, well, the car broke down, and that's telling me that I really am in bad shape here, and I better turn right around. But no, I took the car breaking down as a synchronistic sign, and really a gift that I should actually go all the way out west, and that's what I did.
And I want to dive into the Western journey, but you say a synchronistic sign each step along the way. Gary takes you to Chicago, gives you money. This is
Yes,
unheard of. Gives you money on the journey. Then you hop out of there. You start playing the guitar. People start basically throwing money at you. You were in flow. How did it feel?
it was great. I was in Grant Park, actually, in what it was one of those days when they had an anti-war protest, so it was filled with all kinds of folks. But I was sitting there playing Villalobos, and I was collecting a lot of money, and I slept on the grass for a couple of nights, and then I ran into uh, a VW group of hippies, and they were heading out to San Francisco, and they offered me a ride because I told them I was just going west. I didn't know where, but I was going west. But yeah, I definitely felt like somehow there was a completely unexpected answer to the dream awaiting me, but I had no concept of what or where or how.
So you're going out west, and I've got to say, you've got super mom on your
Yeah, oh
side.
yeah.
Because you call mom. Now you've stolen your dad's car. You've abandoned it on the side of the road. You've left a note. Maybe the car will actually make it back there.
Well, so we're on Route 80, and Route 80 cuts through Nebraska. So you go through Omaha, and then a couple of hours later you hit Lincoln. And when we got near Lincoln, there was a hippie girl, and she said to me, you really ought to call your mom. Gary had suggested that once, but I said, no, not now. So there was a payphone. I, I, I called Mom Collect, and she answered the phone. Oh my God, Stevie, you're alive. We can call off the Pinkertons. They're detectives. And I said, Mom, what? You called the Pinkertons? Are you crazy? This is horrible. And we talked, and I said, "Did you get the car back?" And she said, "Yeah, Dad got it towed back to Long Island, and it's in the shop." And I told her, it's probably a good thing this happened to me because you and Dad might have been in it, and the generator would have broken, and you'd gotten in real trouble. So she wasn't quite sure what to say about that. But I asked her about my cousin George Lamont, who was a former Green Beret, he'd done 2 tours of duty. He lived in the Mission District in San Francisco on Chenery Street, and so I said, well, can you give me George's address? And she did that, and then I just went west. But my mom, she did say in that phone call that she and Dad had reflected a little bit, and that they'd have been better off letting me tutor in the Bronx.
Yes. But it wasn't to be. In all of these things, I call it pulling the golden thread. Each one was leading you forward. So you get out to San Francisco, you end up finding a group that you can meditate and chant and learn from, and a gentleman by the name of Gus. What was going on then?
Well, I actually earned money in the Mission District that summer because I was playing Granados and Ponce and Villalobos in Hispanic restaurants, and it was great. And on the corner of Market Street and Chenery, there was a Nichiren Shosho Buddhist temple, and I loved Buddhism. My teacher at St. Paul's, Rod Wells, had really emphasized that. He knew all these leading figures of the time, like Alan Watts,
Mhm.
and so this was very attractive to me. And I joined this organization, and I chanted Nam Yoho Renge Kyo, and you'd have your beads. And the vibrations and the noise and the energy, it was awesome, and I felt almost like I did in the dream, like I was beyond time and space. And there was a Japanese American who'd actually was from Hawaii originally, and he'd been intern for a while there during the war. His name was Gus, and he became my mentor and my guide. And he would come with me to these restaurants when I was playing. He was always with me, and he emphasized, the purity of mind. He wanted me to be sure that I stayed away from drinking and drugs. He just wanted me to realize that the mind itself, he would say, is a gift. Your mind is a gift. And if you can just awaken to the fact that your mind is connected with this infinite mind, and in ways that you could never imagine, and is capable of so much more than we typically realize, he said, then you will have become enlightened. And so Gus was great. I mean, I loved Gus, and then unfortunately, that summer, I drew a very bad draft number. That was the summer they had the bin, and they just picked numbers out of it. And so I called the people at Reed College in Portland because I had actually got accepted into Reed, but I turned them down to go to Swarthmore. And I called the Reed people. I said, "Look, if you don't let me back in, I'm probably going to wind up going to Vietnam." And they rightly said, "Okay, come on up." And that's the next big part of the story. So I left that one morning about 7 o'clock. We had a little event at the temple. I said goodbye to Gus. I said goodbye to the community. Said goodbye to George. And I took the Market Street bus to Golden Gate Park, and I walked across the park, and then I walked up the bridge.
And this is where it all took place. You're up on the bridge. You've had a dream about looking over a ledge, seeing a mist, and being told something to the effect of, if you save a life, how does the expression? If you save him,
You
you.
too shall live.
What
Yes.
happened?
Well, so it's about 7:45, 8 in the morning, and the Golden Gate Bridge is a long bridge, and I'm walking on the left side because that's where there's a walkway for pedestrians, and then there's a sort of a waist-high fence, and then on the other side of the fence is a ledge. So it's totally cloudy and gray. It's like a morning fog, misty, a little silvery, and I'm walking. I got to the middle of the Golden Gate Bridge, and I looked to my left because I could only see about 4 or 5 feet in front of me, and I actually saw an image that reminded me of the young man I'd seen in my dream. I mean, the stringy blonde hair, and he's out there leaning over the water, hanging onto a wire. And I looked at him, he looked at me, and I said, "I hope you're not planning to jump." And then he looked at me, and there's just a lot of back and forth. It's all in the book. But I said, "Look, I don't think you should jump." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because I had a dream in New Hampshire, and I took my dad's car and I left it in the middle of the high Route 80 in Pennsylvania, and I came all the way out here. And I think somehow or another, it was my destiny to encounter you right here on this bridge." And I spoke softly, and I took about 20 minutes to fill him in on all the details
He's a very patient man for a jumper.
yeah, well, he got mesmerized by the story, and I felt that I was somehow bringing him into this closer rapport with me. And then he said, "Well, I'm jumping," and he recited some Macbeth from Shakespeare, where life is an empty nothingness, and I told him, "Well, you're doing a very good job, and it sounds more realistic when you're out on a ledge about to jump into the sea
Who
than it did
recites Macbeth on the Golden Gate Bridge about to jump in?
This guy was really thoughtful, and I said, "You do as good a job as my classmates did at Memorial Hall at St. Paul's." And because it's a statement about despair, about emptiness. And I told him, I said, "I feel the same way." I said, "I could easily be out there on the ledge." I said, "Most people could easily be out there on the ledge because we all feel this emptiness, and we're all afraid that our souls are being slowly digested by an immoral universe, and everything drives us toward materialism." And I said, "I understand why you're out there. We're actually much closer than you might imagine." And we did have that conversation. And then I said, "But I'd like you to give it a second try, and I have something for you." So in my backpack,
Mhm.
I had a Gohonzon. A Gohonzon is a scroll that can be in Chinese. This one was in Japanese, and it's got symbols of one mind, of the mystery of the universe, of connectivity, of heart, and so forth. And I began to unroll it and explain it to him a little bit. And I said, "Look, if you have a Cajon zone, your whole life will change." Buddhism is like that. They give you something, and suddenly, you're going to get lucky. So, so I said, "I'm going to give this to you. And if I give this to you, actually, they told me, my friend Gus told me, if I gave it away, it would be bad luck for me. But I'm going to give this to you." So, believe it or not, he walked over the railing, and he came to the little walkway where I was. And I explained to him in great detail the Cajon zone. And I said, "I'm going to give this to you, Harry, if if you will walk down the bridge, walk across the Golden Gate Park, get the Market Street Bridge." I gave him a note to my cousin George Lamont, um, and I said, "George, this is Harry. Please let him sleep where I was sleeping on your living room floor, and bring him down to meet Gus and introduce him to the Nichiren Shoshu community." And I didn't know what would happen, but anyway, uh, Harry did walk down, and I walked the other way because I'm going north toward Portland. I was actually hitchhiking toward Portland to get to read, and I actually did make it that evening. And there's a whole nother series of synchronicitous events that occur there. But as I was walking down, that now the sun was coming up, and I just felt somehow or another the dream, in this very weird way, had come true. That that I had gotten all the way out there, and I had encountered this young blonde-haired youth, and I'd been able to talk him off the ledge, and send him to my cousin, and send him to Gus, who was a great spiritual mentor. And that somehow, there is an infinite mind. There is one mind. Larry Dossey wrote the foreword to this book. I love Larry. Uh,
So do I.
uh, uh, and so somehow this was all set up, if you will, set up by the universe. And here I was, and it was breathtaking. So I felt very secure. I felt very transformed because I had had this totally uncanny experience. And if you were statistician, you could say, well, there's one chance in 20 billion that in the history of the universe that this encounter could actually happen. But that's such a stretch. It's much easier to say that some things that happen to us are so uncanny and so spooky and so beautiful that they reflect the work of a truly cherishing infinite mind who loves us all in ways we can hardly even imagine. And that encounter to me was just, love on the bridge.
Woohoo! How did it change your complete worldview or how you would step forward into the world?
Well, I wasn't sure about the dream when I was having it. I talked about it at the Yale Divinity School. I talked about it with my classmates, but it was more abstract. It was ethereal. It was real to me, but I didn't actually know if it was real because I understood that human beings are desperate meaning making creatures. I mean, we need to have meaning in our lives or else we do terrible things to ourselves and to one another. So we can be pretty subjective about meaning, but I also felt that there was an objectivity about this dream, and the fact that it recurred all these times in my 16th and early 17th years, to me, it just was deep and powerful. So, what happened on the bridge was that I came to believe truly in God as this one mind, as this infinite mind that connects us all and that loves us all, and that will go to these incredible lengths to set up this perfect encounter so that I could never, honestly, for the rest of my life, doubt the fact that there is an infinite mind. And I never did.
I've had two near-death experiences. After the first one, I was left with a titanium femur in my left leg, a titanium hip, and two titanium wires that hold it together, and an inch leg length discrepancy. 7 years later, I had a second near-death experience that left me with an identical matching titanium femur in my right leg and titanium hip and two wires that had the doctors actually looking at my website going, how'd you get up the x-ray? We just got you out of surgery. How's it already on the computer? It faked them out. And no more leg length discrepancy.
So,
Zero. Go ahead.
well, that's synchronicity right there. That's how much God loves you.
So and to me that is a reminder. There's no way I can escape that. It's in my bones quite literally. The expression was, you too shall live. Now, if we fast forward in your story, there's a demon possessed
Oh yeah.
shovelhead motorcycle driver, and you did live from that. But I wonder if you too shall live means you are now awake and aware of, we'll call it the ghost in the machine, and a completely different way of moving through the world.
Oh, I think that's true. If you save him, you too shall live. You too shall live was completely clear as I walked north down the Golden Gate Bridge and started thumbing my way to Oregon. But I also had, I wondered if there was maybe a little bit more to the meaning of those words, and that's where the Harley Davidson story comes in at Reed. But that January, late in January, I was in the college coffee shop in the evening it was a Friday night, and um, this guy came bounding through the door. He had a leather jacket on. He was pretty wild-eyed, so I didn't know what was going on with him. But he said, "I've got a new Harley Davidson, and who wants to go for a ride?" And like a fool, I said, "I'll go for a ride." So I went out, got on this big, huge motorcycle, and this guy's name, he said, he introduced himself as Andy. He sped up to about 140 miles an hour. He went through every red light, every stop sign, all the way to the Pacific Coast Highway. And notice, by the way, it doesn't snow in Oregon, but it rains a lot, and it was slick because it was chilly and cold, so there was light ice, slush, I guess I would say. And he drove down for 1 hour at 180 miles an hour toward the California border. And I was crying. I thought I was dead. I thought this was the end of my life. He was swerving around. We were almost falling over. And then he did this incredible U-turn over the midway. And believe it or not, the guy dropped me off exactly at the spot where he'd picked me up. Now it's 11 at night in California, and I walked across this ravine. There's a bridge over a ravine to get to the dormitories, and I stepped into my dorm, into the entrance room, and as I crossed the threshold, the payphone on the wall rang. Now, I never picked up the phone, but I had given the number to my mom when I called her about Ken Kesey. So I picked it up because I felt almost pushed to pick it up. It was completely out of character. I mean, no one could get a hold of me back in those days, and there were no cell phones. So I picked it up and I said hello, and it was my mom. And my mom was in New York. So she's 3,000 miles away, and there's a lot of Rocky Mountains between there and New York. And so uh, I said, "Mom, what's up?" She said, "Well, I just woke up because I was sweating, and I had this incredible premonition that you were dead, and I've never been so fearful in my life." And I said, "Mom, well, I'm not dead, I'm alive, but guess what? I thought I was dead." And I went on to explain to her a little bit about my harrowing motorcycle ride. And that's actually our relationship got much better from there on because she was a bit of an Irish mystic. And I think we both agreed that there's a mystery to the mind, and that a mother could feel this perilous moment in her son's soul from so far away. This was really uniting. And eventually, my mom actually, she was a painter, she was an abstract expressionist of some note. She actually did a painting called The Blue Angel Dream.
Wow. Very cool. And I'm thinking back when I got hit by a car racing in the French Alps. I was trying to make it to the Tour de France. I'm in the hospital, and at the hostel where I was staying, I had a cousin staying there, and he spoke no French, and nobody around there spoke any English. And the phone was ringing behind the hostel desk, and he didn't know why, but he went behind the desk, just never been behind the desk, not allowed probably behind the desk, and picked up the phone to get a call from the hospital in English saying where I was. There is so
Wow.
much more at work. So let's dive into this. This is the second part of the interview, and I want to talk about the how-to. Diving in, what does one mind mean to you?
One mind means to me that before there was matter in the universe, there was mind. So all these great traditions say, in the beginning was the word. And if you're a Hindu, you have the idea of the supreme mind that is beyond time and beyond space, but is also loving. And from that, the universe is generated. So all of the matter, the energy of the universe, is really a manifestation of this one mind. And if we can just awaken to that and celebrate it joyfully, we can live much happier lives because we're not so alone, we're not isolated. And also, we have within ourselves some grain of this infinite mind in the form of an eternal soul.
Mhm.
And if we can, what I do every morning, I get up real early and I cultivate that inner being through meditation and prayer. And I kind of do a dress rehearsal because I've worked in medical schools for 35 years, U Chicago, Ann Arbor, 20 years, Case Western in Cleveland, now in Stony Brook. I run programs. I meet all kinds of people. I do clinical ethics consultations with very imperiled families struggling to make decisions. So I'm always encountering uh, people who are on desperate detours, and I And I ask myself, I kind of know what my schedule is. I ask myself, how can I manifest this divine love in my interactions? And so that when I wrote "Why Good Things Happen to Good People: How to Live a Longer, Healthier, Happier Life Through the Simple Act of Giving," it's about kindness, it's about forgiveness, it's about creativity, it's about compassion, it's about loyalty, and I kind of think about intuitively, empathically, the people I'm going to encounter and what they need. And so when I come into that encounter later in the day, I can be there with the right heart, and it's intuitive, but it's worked pretty well for me over the years, and that's how I live my life. Every morning I'm up at 5 o'clock. My wife, I've been married for 37 years. My wife will say that ever since she's known me, I've been up that early, and I spend an hour just meditating deeply, uh, uh, wanting to be awakened to the inward light and to be guided and blessed over the course of the day through loving interactions.
Beautiful. I'm going to dive into some of your 10 key lessons here. But before we do that, I know for myself, for instance, I'm not into politics and I'm not into the car horn because I even see the person who has cut me off in front of me as me or an element of me. These people who you're working with, who you're seeing, who you're writing to, how do you see quote unquote others?
Well, that's a very important point for me. So, when I was I actually, believe it or not, I've taught in medical schools all my career, and I had been an immunologist for a while, and I had done pediatric hermaphroditism for a little while, but I quit all the sciences and I went to the University of Chicago Divinity School to study with Mircea Eliade, who wrote Shamanism, and
Awesome.
Joseph Campbell, who was the visiting professor there. And I told those two guys,
Mhm.
Joseph Campbell, always dapper with a nice tie and a jacket, and Mircea Eliade bent over with these tufts of hair coming out his ears. I told him my story of the Blue Angel dream as a 15-year-old in the bottom of Swift Hall in the Swift Kick coffee shop,
Yep.
and Campbell said, quote, "Synchronicity, not luck." And Mircea Eliade asked me, "So is it all synchronicity?" And then we started talking. But so I always like to say that the University of Chicago Divinity School, which is like a haven for people studying world religions and world spirituality, they said it's a place where every blue angel dreamer needs to end up. but
Woohoo!
but yeah, well, where were we going? I'm sorry.
Where we're
Remind me.
going is how you view, and I put it in quotes, others.
Oh yeah. So, Martin Buber, the great uh, Jewish mystic, theologian, philosopher, he said there's two ways to live in the world. There's actually three, I'm going to add, but the two he focused on, it. So I'm the center of the universe. I only relate to other people to the extent that they contribute to my little narrow, selfish human agendas and no further. And then the other way of relating to others is the spiritual way, where you're not uh, just being materialistic, but you're also in touch with your inner being, with your spiritual essence. And the spiritual emotions come in, and you actually realize the infinite value of the other. It's like namaste. I honor the divine in you, and you honor the divine in me. So, but there's more to it than I, it, I, thou, because there's also I. And I use this. So I was interviewed by the New York Times. There was a guy 11 years ago who was standing on a platform in Midtown Manhattan, and he had his two little girls by his side. He was an African American Navy vet, and somebody had a seizure and they fell over onto the tracks into a little gully. And this guy uh, left his kids behind. He jumped off the platform, and he put his body on top of this fellow who happened to be white, by the way, and was a stockbroker and is very different in every respect. And unbelievably, the train actually rolled over them, and no one was hurt because they were in a bit of a valley there, and everybody clapped. And they asked the guy, why he did that, and he said, well, his name was Wesley Autry. He said, well, I did this because I was in the Navy, and in the Navy, that's what we do. But my view of it, don't give me any genetic explanations. Don't give me any explanations that get into sort of, the ultimate activities of the selfish gene. The bottom line is that to do something like that, you're beyond I and thou. You're into I. You have to have a consciousness somehow or another that when you save that person, you save yourself. So that's the third stage. That's the stage of real moral enlightenment. There's I, it, there's I, thou, and there's I.
Beautiful. And I believe that's something, well, I don't know. Can you work toward I, or is it simply a letting go and dropping in? In other words, there was no thought of, hey, let's switch to I right now.
No, it was not conscious. It was not intentional. But the thing is that in that moment, somehow because of his journey in life, he was there for it. And I do believe that if we uh, live generous lives, when I was up in St. Paul's, I loved Norman Rockwell's picture of the Golden Rule with everybody meditating so peacefully on the words "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." And there's so much tranquility. There's so much peace in their expressions. I think that we can get there, but we just have to be somewhat forgetful. We have to be forgetful of ourselves, and we have to really put aside the human, humus meaning human ground body. Put that aside and just really concentrate on our inner being, and then these spiritual emotions and feelings and tendencies, they can just come into us and they become natural.
If we're being pulled in today's world with multimedia and the phone and the computer, the internet, the Netflix, everything, we are pulled in so many directions. How do we do that?
Right. So it's very, very challenging to do that, and discipline is key. So, I mean, when I get up in the morning, I'm always up at 5. Again, it drives my wife a little crazy, and I have some very specific practices that I go through, breathing things, but also I have some guiding phrases that I've developed over the course of my life that really shape everything for me. And I spend an hour uh, in that place, and it's so important because then, if I go out into the world with all its distractions and all its pressures, I'm not susceptible. But I have to say, okay, I mean, Michael, I am capable of of occasionally falling full-breasted on the horn of my car because some poor guy in front of me had the audacity to slow down at a yellow light. I mean, I have done that. My wife will tell me, and she'll scold me, "You need to be more patient." But those were always the days when, uh, and it's very rare, but it's the days when I didn't take the time early on to cultivate spirit. And the Jewish rabbis, the old Talmudic rabbis, said that the best time to meditate is early in the morning. It's a very interesting concept. Why? Well, there are a couple of things. They said, number one, the world hasn't been corrupted. People aren't screaming at each other. They're not running from point A to point B at the speed of light. So they're coming out of sleep, and they have a sense of sort of being beyond time and beyond place. So there's a sort of infinity about their consciousness. And the other thing is that if they're going to connect with this infinite mind, this supreme being, this original mind, that's the time to do it because they're not caught up in the world. And so I really believe in taking advantage of the early morning, and I like the Hindus, the Brahma Kumaris, the Buddhists who, will meditate at 4 in the morning or 6 in the morning. It really is an ideal time. It's so peaceful, and you can make so much uh, connection with with the one mind at that early time of day.
I love it. I call that the holy hour because we used to live outside New York City. In fact, there's an interesting story about my last monodigital response. And we lived outside New York City, and what we realized is, you fly over the city, you fly over the East Coast at night, and you see almost the whole place is glowing bright now. It's all connected. And I look at that as the field. And when the field sleeps in the early morning hours and they're not rushing on their way to work, you can dive into the mind and you can dive in deep. When people wake up, and we lived outside the city where people are fighting to get into the city, that's what you're plugging into as well. And in fact, the last time that I know I did the monodigital response, I was going into Coach a Rabbi in the city. And I'm driving into the city, and I've got somebody's smart pass that I'm borrowing in my car. And the light doesn't switch as I go through a toll booth. And I stop and I try to figure out, well, what am I going to do? If I go through, I'm going to get like a $500 ticket. And a guy behind me in like a giant black Escalade lays on the horn with everything that he's got. And eventually I gave him that one-fingered, greeting.
Right.
And I pulled over afterwards to cry because in that moment I had forgotten. And we always forget, but I had really forgotten. And I'm like, it's not important what happened in the situation, but you cannot forget that.
You cannot forget. And when I came back from the West Coast to New York, I got my first job. I was a licensed hemodialysis technician. There was so much pressure living in Brooklyn Heights, just to forget about the dream and the infinite mind and the experiences I'd had. But fortunately, I started doing things that made sense given the dream, and that kind of saved me. But look, New York, if there's any environment that will drive you away from these deeper realities, in Japanese, the symbol for no heart, for busy, is a heart with a line drawn through it. So no heart, because you're just so busy running running from point A to point B, getting someplace that you're just totally inattentive to the inner life, and that's a bad thing.
You just reminded me of the Japanese symbol for a person. I think it's hito, which is two lines, one leaning on another. And
Mhm.
and one way you can interpret that is we are all together in this, but another way is that you are interconnected to everyone and everything.
Yeah, very much so, and the Japanese culture understands that historically. I mean, look, the Long Island, there's a story about the Long Island Expressway in the book. So I was
Yes.
up in St. Paul's, and I mean, I was around, some pretty amazing people: Gary Trudeau, Charlie Scribner, all these folks, and they all came from a little more upper crust world than I did. And so we had to give talks in the chapel in our final year, and I gave a talk about how my mother and father met and how we don't really control our lives, and life isn't something we make, like we grasp onto it and we're responsible for everything that happens. Reality is, we're on a journey, and if we keep the faith, we will encounter people surprisingly, and we can respond to them in love and creativity. And so we respond more than we make. We make somewhat, but mostly we're responding on a journey. And I said, look at the way I was born. My mom and dad, after the war, they were working in New York, and they were driving driving out to Long Island, and my dad rear-ended my mom on the Long Island Expressway. And I said, "Look, this isn't some great arranged marriage in the Vanderbilt estate,
Yeah.
but this is how I came into being." And my mother always said that it was a divine action.
I
So
love it. So, all right, I want to ask about a few more things, then we'll dive into a meditation here. You mentioned something very powerful earlier. You said that in the morning you have some guided phrases that you go through. Would you mind sharing a few of those with us?
I'd be happy to, because they're not complicated, and I do the same phrases every morning. And it's interesting. Over the last even 40 years, I've tried to refine them, and sometimes the wording has changed slightly, but not much. So the first one, I mean, I start with I because unless we as individuals connect with the divine, and unless we can love ourselves, it's very, very difficult to love anybody else over the course of the day, you
Yeah.
know? So,
Well, that's part
so
of the golden rule. Do unto others as we'd have others do unto ourselves. We have to love ourselves first, or how do we even know how to treat others?
100%. And learning how to love oneself properly is the beginning of the love of neighbor. So I totally agree with that. And anyway, so I say to myself, I am deeply aware of your infinite mind of pure, unlimited love, and of the radiant inner light within me. I am healed and healing. I am secure, peaceful, and kind, creative, prosperous, and mirthful in an age of pure, unlimited love. That's what I say. And so you like deeply aware, meaning, just take the time to really feel inside this oneness with the infinite mind. And radiant inner light, because this is radiance. This is what radiance is about. And it's the source of joy and all these higher spiritual emotions, compassion and so forth. And then, healed and healing. So I've spent all these years in all these great medical schools. People sometimes don't know what drives me, but everywhere I've gone, I mean, I just say this, I've gotten a reputation as being the person to whom people come when they're sharing problems about their kids who have drug problems or this loss or that loss, and they show up at the door, and I'm always there for them. I just make special commitment to heal the healers around me. And so that's why, even though I'm a University of Chicago Divinity School PhD, I have some background in clinical pastoral care, but I basically always lived in medical schools to work with the healers, and so to heal and to be healing. And then there's no kindness unless, really, human nature is not the greatest thing if it's uncoupled from the divine. So the whole thing about um, secure means secure um, in our divine essence, in our divine inner being. And then from that comes a feeling of peacefulness, so we're not as affected by the crazy world around us. And then comes kindness. So kindness is grounded in our inner being, and also creative qualities too. I mean, I love these stories, like, Ramanujan, the man who knew infinity, or Einstein, who did his Gedanke experiments, or all these incredibly creative people who, they just felt that they were intuitively invaded by these insights, and they were far beyond themselves in their origins. So they really, creativity, prosperity, because I do think that we need we need to be somewhat prosperous, because that way we can unfold our creativity in the world. If we don't have any means at our disposal, our creativity is stifled, and then finally mirth. So I'm notorious. I got to tell you, notorious. Like in this medical school, uh, I tell always uplifting, cute little jokes, and some of them are pretty childish. Like the one I was doing the other day was, "What did the 0 say to the 8?" Answer: "Nice belt." Or things like, "What did the envelope say to the stamp?" "Stick with me and we'll go places." And I always have like a somatic element to it, so I kind of act it out.
Yeah.
And I've had that tendency actually when I met Harry on the bridge. It was a little bit like Alice's restaurant. I mean, I was kind of acting it out a little bit, and doing somatic things, because I like to be that engaging. But I love mirthfulness, and I think that if we're close to the infinite mind, there is this kind of playfulness about us. There's a kind of lightness of being, and you don't want to be somber. You don't want to be so heavy-handed that you frighten people away. And I guess having survived for 35 years in medical schools around some very skeptical scientists, I mean, I got to tell you, I got to Stony Brook. I'd started this institute for research on unlimited love, but I was really, my day job was Case Western Med School, medical humanities, teaching empathic communication, and so forth. But this cub reporter from a local paper here, which I never heard of, had gotten a hold of some of my interviews in the past, and I got into this pizza place the first night my family and I arrived in Stony Brook. It was raining like crazy, and lo and behold, um, uh, there's one paper in the foyer on the rack, and it's the Three Village Herald. Again, I'd never heard of this thing. The only the only headline on the paper front page was "Unlimited Love Comes to Stony Brook." I about died. And
Woohoo!
so, and they'd interviewed the dean here, who was a pediatric transplant surgeon who did Gary Coleman, by the way, Richard Fine, and my chair.
Mhm.
And they said, "Well, we're not sure about this unlimited love business, but we think you can do a really good day job." And so, unbelievably, like a couple of days later, I actually show up in the medical school, and I'm going up the escalator. And there's this guy he's a very nice guy. He's a friend of mine now. And he kind of looks like Mr. Clean. He's got big, strong arms, muscular, and he's up there at the top of the escalator looking down. And I'm wondering what's going on here. So I'm getting closer to him and closer to him. And he looks at me and he said, "Are you Dr. Post?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "I have one question for you. Are you going to save us?" I couldn't believe it. And I said, "Well, sir, I sounds like you read that article. I'm not sure I'm going to do that, but I'll do the best I can." And we became friends. But you better be mirthful, because if you're going to deal with these kinds of deep ideas in a materialistic world where so many people are on desperate detours and they're just caught in these negative spaces and struggling to find meaning and purpose in life, you better be a little mirthful, because otherwise you're not going to be able to pull it off.
Woohoo! Two, I think three more quick questions that we'll dive into a meditation. First off, I just got to point out in my notes here, I have a note number 5, purchased a Gohonzon scroll. Note number 6, name was Ho for telling jokes. And I look at the two of them and I go, Ho is in Gohonzon.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. Yeah, when I was at St. Paul's, they called me the boy for an interesting reason, because we had a cross country coach who called everybody the boy Smith or the boy Post or the boy. But my brother had been there before me, so he already took up the boy Post. So I was just the boy. And in the book, I actually refer to myself as the boy, but also because I was always telling these. I never told derisive jokes, and I tried to kind of make it uplifting and spiritual, and people enjoyed that, so they called me Ho because I made them laugh.
Woohoo! All right, what does it mean to be all in with the dream or to be all in with God?
Well, you know, in the last chapter, I talk a little bit about the interpretation of dreams, and for example, if you read uh, the Muslim theologians, the Sufi mystics, in the 1200s, 1300s, everything they wrote was about the interpretation of dreams. What's a dream you want to follow? What's a dream you want to be a little skeptical about? They really thought through dreams, and it's part of their culture. So, there are some dreams that, I don't want everybody to go out and follow every dream they have, but if it's a good dream, if it's a dream about helping others, if it's a loving dream, if you feel love in that dream and it's pulling you in a certain direction, then you want to take it seriously. It doesn't mean you have to, take dad's car, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you do. And so if you don't follow your dreams, and I mean, I could have being St. Paul's students. I mean, they wind up, they go onto Wall Street. They become stock investors. J.P. Morgan was the most famous graduate of the place, I suppose, years and years ago. But you want to be really careful, because if you lose your dream and you lose your soul, then you're going to have a midlife crisis. Maybe you'll be like Ivan Ilyich, Tolstoy's figure, who at the moment of death suddenly has actually a near-death experience, like you've had too, and he sees all the light, and he comes out of it, and suddenly he's changed, and he sees his son's hand on his hand, and he feels love for his son for the first time, and then he feels love for his wife, and then he kind of intentionally, now it's okay, he can stretch out and he can have a good dying. But even though that's there's always hope for everybody, you kind of wish that he'd had that experience early on. And I really believe in adolescent spirituality. Lisa Miller, a friend of mine at Columbia Teachers College, wrote a book called The Spiritual Child a couple of years ago. And young people have deep experiences, and in their innocence and their childishness, God can somehow reach into their hearts and minds in powerful ways. So even if you're 15 or 16 years old and everybody's kind of laughing at you, and I mean, at St. Paul's, people didn't quite know what to do with me. Although this book is endorsed by my dormitory mother, Julie Norman, who was Broadwell's his wife. She divorced him eventually, but she says, I remember Stephen in the days of the Blue Angel Dream. I lived in Brewster dormitory, and I wondered about him. I thought he had this kind of innocence that no one else had, and he was unsophisticated, and I loved that. And she said, I wondered what was going to happen to him, but I thought he was going to be a total failure
Mhm.
or he was going to be a great success. And she thought I'd been a great success, and she loved me in the right way. She was my spiritual mother at the time.
Awesome. Where can people go to find out more, Stephen, and to find your beautiful book?
Well, they can. My website is Stephen with the PhG, like Gary Post.com. And the institute that I started with Sir John, who was a great mentor, and he's in the book, on the One Mind. That's unlimitedloveinstitute.org. And also, just pick the book up on Amazon or whatever your favorite site might be. It's a paperback. It's available electronically. But it to me, I wanted to write this book for so many years, and I acknowledge I was a little cautious because I've been tenured at these universities and I'm well established. Um, I wanted to give many people the opportunity to talk about the infinite mind, to talk about the oneness, because they're so inhibited. They're in these materialistic environments. If you start even honestly talking about these uncanny experiences that are just so improbable and so beautiful, and they're God winks and God whispers, I call them in the book. They're so scared to even acknowledge this reality in their life. Like Larry Dossey says, they notice them, but they're afraid to talk about what they notice.
Well, you did Larry Dossey proud with this book.
He's a great guy. So way back, I'm talking 1989. I was at a conference outside of Dulles Airport, and I met Larry for the first time there. But it was the night when he had dinner with Sir John, and a friend of mine, Dave Larson, and I set that up. And then Sir John supported Larry in those early conferences he had out in New Mexico on the idea of the one mind. And this idea is very defensible. It's incredibly defensible, philosophically, scientifically. I've never encountered a neurobiologist who I thought could in any way begin to explain how mind could emerge from matter.
Any last words you want to share, Stephen? We can go on and on. I'm kid in the candy store. Any last words you want to share before we dive into a meditation?
Well, I'm just grateful, very grateful for all the people I've met on Route 80, and everybody has their Route 80. Now, there are lots of different highways, and in my case, it happened to be Route 80. But it could be 90, it could be 10, it could be 40, it could be 101, it could be all sorts of places. But realize that life, if you see it spiritually, life is a journey, and you don't want your little goals, that you conjure up with your small mindedness and maybe your ambitions. You don't want those to deflect you from having a deep feeling for the destiny. And every soul has a destiny in this life, and it has to do with love and kindness and service and meaning and purpose. So don't don't ever forget that your destiny is more important than your goals.
Woohoo! I was called once. It's interesting. I ended up at the Taos Pueblo, ancient adobe structures, thousands of year old Native American people, and I was called into this shop. Robert Mirabal, two-time Grammy Award winner, looks at me and he goes, "Are you a runner? Are you guys runners?" To my wife and myself, and he calls us into the back. And we just written the book Barefoot Running. We were looking at Native American moccasins for running, all this stuff. And he holds up these two ancient moccasins that I'd seen in a book that was 100 years old called Indian Running. And he goes, "I called you guys here because I live in a magical world. We all live in that magical world if we would simply let go and allow what I call road magic, which is what your beautiful book is all about, that road magic to come to us."
Thank you.
It has been such an honor and a treat, Stephen. Would you mind leading us in a guided meditation, anything of your calling?
Well, okay, so briefly, close your eyes and relax your
Unless you're
body.
unless you're driving down the road, do this later then.
That's right. Or you can do it open-eyed if you want. Um, just breathe deeply and relax, and imagine in great detail an image of people from every background, people who are brown and black, yellow and white, a sea of faces, people from every kind of tradition, someone in a denim jacket just rubbing his chin, a rabbi, uh, a Buddhist meditator. Just think of people from every possible spiritual side of life and every age, from the young child, the toddler, to the old woman. And there are no boundaries in this image. So it just goes all around the world and embraces our shared and common humanity. And then look at these faces. The faces, they look very, very calm, and they're thinking to themselves, how can I contribute to the lives of others? And just by thinking that way, all the negative, destructive emotions are shut off. Bitterness, hostility, rumination, anger, hatred, those things no longer exist because everyone is thinking compassionately, what can I do to contribute to the lives of others? And in that mindfulness, they suddenly feel, they awaken to an inner being. A light is going on. See that light going on. And now they all are subtly aware. They begin to just sense that they are much more connected than they ever knew, and that we are all one, and that we can move forward into the future, finally, and enter an age of pure, unlimited love. That's it.
Woohoo! Thank you so, so much, Stephen. This was much more than I even bargained for. This was phenomenal.
Well, you're phenomenal. I got to tell you, it takes two to tango, and you do a fabulous job. Fabulous. I cannot believe it. It's like a miracle.
So it goes both ways. I love what you're doing. I love what you do. I cannot express enough how much I love what you're doing. And that you just, well, let's bring it full circle here. You just put yourself back out on a ledge now, didn't you?
Well, this book, I'm kind of curious about how people will respond to it, because, but it doesn't matter. I wrote it because I wanted people to be free. I know there are a lot of people just like me and just like you, and they have these uncanny moments. They're incredible, and like even when Mitsuko and my wife, I came from Ann Arbor, Michigan. It was the summer of '85. I got a job at Fordham teaching philosophy for a few years before I went out to Case Med, and I had to spend all my money, like $12,000, to get a decent apartment in Tarrytown, and I was cashed out, and so and we had our little daughter Emma with us, and we wanted to go into the Howard Johnson's diner. So Mitsuko and I meditated. We said a little prayer, and Mitsuko asked for $100 to come from nowhere, from the universe. And then there was a little tap on the car that I didn't even feel, and she said, "Stephen, someone just hit our car." And I said, "No, no." So I went out, and there was this big guy. This is in the book. He's like 6'4". He's a wonderful African American fellow with a white suit on, a white hat on. He says, "Oh, don't worry about a thing. We'll settle this the old-fashioned way." And he pulled out his wallet, and he gave me this shining $100 bill. And I took it, and I said, "Sir, you are the answer to a Blue Angel dream." And so you're so scared to talk about these things with people openly, but if we can begin to be open about it, then we can begin to notice more about how cherished, truly cherished, each and everyone is, no matter what we blame ourselves for, no matter how hard we have struggled to forgive ourselves for things that we have done that haven't been too great. But we're all totally 100% purely cherished, and we need to be able to talk about it. And synchronicity is a way to do it.
Woohoo! There's not a person alive who hasn't experienced, maybe not as profound. That was the one in a gazillion. There's a new number. The one in a gazillion. We need $100. Boop, boop. Here, may I give you $100?
It was amazing.
But they're there. They're always happening. And I think you talk about in the book, somebody says, how can you prove God? Do you think we'll ever, actually the exact thing was, do you think we'll ever be able to prove God? Well, if these kind of experiences don't do that, then what would?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get God and love on Route 80, and begin diving into one mind and your dreams today, and shine bright. Woohoo! Wow, 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 wow.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
This was beautiful, Stephen. This was absolutely, it was phenomenal.
Well, I'm honored, to be able to, and I'm a little older now. I'm actually 68, and I still feel like, the Blue Angel dream I had when I was a kid is like a thread throughout my life. The Chagall stuff was so powerful, and it's just, if you can follow a dream, and not that there aren't some hard times, but if you can be mirthful and follow a dream, it's really worth it. And I believe I've been protected and helped a lot, and maybe I've had an easier time than I would have otherwise.
Well, you were certainly protected on that motorcycle that day.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I just had the most amazing time talking with Stephen G. Post. To check out more incredible videos on connecting with one mind, click here, subscribe below.